Hey, Siviwe. This is Tommy, the professor of the course. Great to have you, man. Welcome. And wanted to send you a reply video here as we get started in the course. Gives me a chance to say hello a little more directly and get our conversation for the course started off. So, so glad to hear your intro in the intro forum and to know you've been part of this MJA cohort, and that's been a good experience. That was good to hear. So a few highlights for you on what you've written here in the first week, which is excellent. The first is the way that you have recognized um, this kind of tension that exists in Israel's history, its memory in the Bible. It is a tension that involves the promise, God's election, irrevocable commitment to this people, and also demands, commands, uh, guidance for the way this people is to live. And the challenge is to sort of maintain this tension. As you've said at the end here, is what I've got in front of me is the first forum. The Christian tradition has often allowed that tension to kind of break down in our imagination. And so we imagine that what we get in the Bible is God giving commands to Israel. And if they don't keep it, God disowns them and replaces them with other people, the Gentile church or something like that. But as you said, that's not the way Paul teaches in Romans. It's not true to the memory of Israel that we get in the law and the prophets. And it's not true to Matthew either. As we see again and again, when Israel strays, when they forsake the covenant, when they're unfaithful, when they become immersed in injustice and idolatry, God still refuses to abandon them. There are consequences in their life over generations for how they live, but these consequences are themselves an expression of God's ongoing presence to Israel, involvement with Israel. They're not an expression of God's repudiating Israel. And so, this tension of irrevocable promise and uh, sort of drama that is a matter of Israel's obedience and disobedience, that's what we've got to hold together. And this comes out really, I think, poignantly in Matthew's gospel in a way that has all kinds of implications for the pursuit of justice in our world. Jesus is rejected by some of the authorities of his people. He is rejected by some of the crowds in his generation. He's finally deserted by his own disciples, all of them. There's, I suppose, some exception of some of his female disciples who are courageous and faithful to the end. But the 12, for example, all scatter and desert him in the end. They're complicit eventually in his betrayal and his denial. And yet, Jesus does not reject them, does not forsake the people who give up on him or abandon him. He remains steadfast in his faithfulness to his people, even when they are unfaithful to him. And this is an expression of how God is with Israel, how God is with us. We see this from the opening scenes of Matthew in the baptism, for example, which we'll be studying this coming week, where rather than remain aloof from his people's plight, their corruption, their sins, their injustices, their idolatry, which have culminated in so many terrible consequences for their life, including foreign occupation by Rome, Jesus wades into the waters of baptism with the rest of the people gathering to John, who is Elijah, who was to come, preparing the way for this coming of kingdom from heaven. and he is in solidarity with his people's sins. He refuses to know his people's sins as anything other than his own. And that act of solidarity in baptism with his people is, in fact, the occasion for his anointing as the Messiah, as the ultimate heir of God's rule on the earth, the one who inherits ruling power to bring justice and peace and healing to all of Israel and with it to all the peoples of the world, the Son of God, in the language of the Psalter and Matthew. So the solidarity of Jesus with his people and their corruption is key to who he is. And I think it's key to the way that he discloses God to us and calls upon us as we pursue justice as his disciples to make that pursuit not one where we are threatening people who don't get with the program with being abandoned or disowned by us because they're not righteous enough, or to feel insecurity or defensiveness ourselves about maybe not living up to some ideal. Instead, we pursue justice with confidence and the resolve that God remains with us even when we are unfaithful, and that there is always a way forward with people, even when they reject the call to justice or become perpetrators of terrible injustice themselves. So that's just one way of teasing out some of the implications of who Israel is as that plays out in the life of Jesus according to Matthew. There's a lot of things, other things I can highlight in what you said in the second forum about the kind of story of Israel evoked by Jesus. You talk about the testimony of these Gentile mothers of Jesus. I think that's important. And it's good to remember that three of those four mothers of Jesus are also mothers of King David, who are mentioned in the genealogy of First Chronicles. So the inclusion of Gentiles, the inclusion of women in a genealogy of a royal figure is not something that's without precedent in Israel's memory. And that's another sense in which this genealogy is not so much a corrective as it is a fulfillment, a filling out of what has gone before in Israel's past. You talked, I think, about distinction and inclusion as another sort of tension going on in Israel's life. And I think that remains true throughout Matthew as well, as you see highlighted with this genealogy. Uh, Israel always had ways of adopting Gentiles into its family, even as Gentile life could pose a threat to Israel if Israel surrendered, you might say, to Gentile gods and pursued the security and prosperity that might come from surrounding Gentile kingdoms, but at the price of their faithfulness to Israel's God and that God's law. And so that's another tension that remains true throughout Matthew. Jesus does relate to certain Gentile people as posing a threat to his people, including a Canaanite mother in Matthew 15, Pilate in the trials that Jesus faces at the end. But that threat is not something that is absolute. It is finally met by God's grace and God's mercy. And so we see how this border between Israel and Gentiles, as historic and hostile as it is, has always been porous. And with the power of Jesus, begins, you might say, to open even more generously and scandalously than it already had throughout Israel's memory in the Bible. The key is, though, that that's a function of God's ongoing faithfulness to Israel and Jesus. The hope of the Gentiles is in this God that does not give up on God's promises to God's people. It's not the hope of a people that can claim Israel's God at the expense of Israel. And that's important, I think, for what holds us together as communities. It's not rival commitments to God and competing with one another over who are the true Christians or those who are truly faithful, but instead celebrating together the generosity of the God that has adopted us into God's family. Um, you talked about David, rightly, I think, and also some of the particulars of Jesus's kingship. David, of course, was a pillar figure in Israel's memory because of what David did as a king to set Israel on a course of commitment to Israel's God. But of course, he's not really an ideal king either. And the genealogy mentions precisely what was perhaps the most embarrassing and shameful moment in David's kingdom, the adultery with the wife of Uriah, eventually murdering Uriah. And yet, that's the moment that is highlighted in the genealogy. So, the genealogy doesn't scrub the dynasty of David or the history of Israel. It presents it in all of its moral ambiguity, including its shame and failure. And that, I think, is key to who Jesus is in relation to David. And then David was already a peculiar king politically because you might remember, for example, that he refused to raise a hand against what he called God's anointed, Saul, to dethrone Saul and to usurp the throne for himself. Instead, he insisted on waiting upon the movement of God to give him the throne as God had promised him through Samuel and others. And similarly, Jesus does not sort of march into the Sanhedrin and claim some kind of immediate power to rule Israel. But this doesn't mean that he's not a political figure. He is engaged in calling a community of disciples within Israel, speaking to the crowd, shaping a movement that is redistributing power, redistributing wealth according to his teaching. And because of that, he does come to pose a political threat to the government that's based in Jerusalem, and finally, even to Rome's representative, Pilate, who orders his execution. So even though Jesus doesn't conform to some of our conventional criteria of political rule, I think we want to be open to a peculiar kind of political power that Jesus embodies that does actually engage the political structures that he inherited and will continue to engage the political structures that we have inherited. What we want to learn from Jesus, especially in the pursuit of justice, is how to engage the political structures of our societies wisely, according to the kind of politics of the Messiah that we can learn from Matthew's gospel. So we'll talk more about that, but just wanted to put that on the table for you to think about in light of what you've written. Thanks again for some great work here in week 1, and looking forward to more conversation with you. Hope you'll be able to join some of the live Zoom discussion groups. And I've tried to include some times that I think might work for you because I think you're a good 10 hours or so later than us here in Los Angeles. So welcome to the course again, Siviwe. Looking forward to working with you this term.